Hey, welcome back to Vortex Garage, and today we're going to be working on our F250 again. It's a single cab, 8-foot bed, 4-wheel drive F250, vinyl floors, vinyl seats, really good work truck spec. It's a V10, which is awesome. It had pretty much been attacked by squirrels where it came from, so.
On our last video, we prepped and coated the frame and replaced the fuel pump. Afterwards, while moving the truck, one of the rear brake lines blew. Now we knew they'd need replacement, and well, that certainly bumped it up on the list. Today, we're going to start tackling the brake system as we work to rehab this old but high potential F250. Of course, before any of that can happen, we have to do something pretty simple, or at least it should be simple: remove the axle vent. Now, I know what you're thinking. How can the removal of a simple axle vent be difficult? Well, you see, in this design, the flexible brake hose that feeds the axle-mounted hardlines is, well, it's actually secured to the axle tube using the vent. That's right, the vent actually doubles as a hollow bolt. Now, the problem is that the dissimilar metals of the brake line mount and the vent cause it to basically corrode weld itself together. Mix that in with rust damaging the hex, and no socket we tried would grab. Even cutting it off didn't quite solve it. We actually had to cut the metal end of the brake line and use a chisel to get that off. Now once that was done, the axle vent came out fine, albeit in pieces.
Oh, look at that. That's awesome. It's totally loose now. I'll even use the vice grips. And I don't have the best angle on the camera, but because I did this all by myself. There, look at that. We got the vent out. Sweet. All right, so here is our replacement brake hose, and as you can see a little more clearly on this one, you can sort of see how it would have attached on our rear axle. So you have your vent line, which is actually a bolt as well. It's a hollow bolt that drives your vent. So on this particular vent bolt, what ends up happening is it basically rusts into here. The hex rusts to the edge of this, and it becomes pretty difficult to get off. In fact, on ours, the hex was just rusted so bad that it was deformed. No sockets really fit it well. On this particular one, the vent hose was attached. You're going to want to check that and make sure you either replace the vent hose or make sure it's in good shape. On ours, even though the vent hose was technically there, it was still full of mud or something in it. And as you can see, this vent was plugged. So it's good that we're doing this. Here's a Dorman part. You can buy this pretty much any part store, anywhere online. You don't have to go to the dealer. I think it was about $5, maybe less. And it's a very commonly used vent plug on Fords. And let's take a look. As you can see, there's our replacement right there. And we're going to be able to put a new one of these in. We'll put some anti-seize on it so we don't have problems in the future. But honestly, hopefully, it's going to be many years since we pull it apart, until we pull it apart. Which is another reason to use the anti-seize, I guess. I'm not really planning to pull it apart in a couple weeks. And this will serve to be our vent, hold down our line, and then we'll put a new rubber vent line and route it correctly, and we'll show you that later. But in the meantime, what we're doing now is getting our brakes back in shape. So let's press ahead.
As we press ahead, you might notice those shiny yellow shock absorbers. Well, they were installed off camera. Well, kind of like the outer rear brake flex lines you may see. Anyway, as we started to reinstall this rear line and vent and bend our new hard lines for the axle, I noticed something odd with the line flare nuts.
Here's what my concern is. I went to start working on bending some new brake lines for the rear axle, and all right, something's weird here. Oh, this is bizarre. So basically, and I can't fathom why, of 4 connections, so you have 4 connections here. You have, this comes down to the rear axle. You have this connection and this connection. They each branch out to the caliper, and then you have a connection on either side. So you have 4 connections to make with hardline. 3 of those connections use the smaller 3/8 flare nut,
and one of them uses a 7/16 flare nut. I cannot understand why that is. There is no rhyme or reason, and it just boggles my mind. And it's from the factory as well. So if I look here on the factory one, I can thread this bigger one in on this side. Threads in just fine. And then the smaller one on this side. Okay, why? Why would you do that? And now I'm looking at the fact that I don't have a flare nut that's going to work with the 3/16 hose. So I'm going to have to come up with a solution on that. The solution, of course, was ordering the right flare fitting and waiting on delivery to continue. And that was a 7/16 24 for a 3/16 line. That means if you want to make these connections from that rear hose to either side of the rear brakes, you're going to need 4 fittings in total, 3 of them being 3/8 24s for 3/16 line, and of course 1 that is 7/16 24 for 3/16 line. Why? Well, I suppose the only reason I can even guess is that maybe it's to keep someone from installing the brake line backwards. But hey, who knows? Our vent line, which is a hollow nut. You can probably see there I've put some anti-seize on it. Hopefully I'm not in the way here, but we're going to put this through our brake hose like that. And then we'll come in here, get it started in our axle tube. But we're not going to make it super tight because we don't want to break it, but we want to make it tight enough that it doesn't come loose. I'll slip off it like a goof. And our hose is nice and tight, we're good to go. How this thing wants to go. Like that. Look at that. It's super simple. There we go. It didn't take much looking at the original brakes to decide to just replace everything. Rotors were rusty, pads were shot, and calipers crusty. In parts ordering, we ended up getting a cheap set of rotors, non-coated ones. Now the downside to these is they're more prone to rusting on the areas that don't contact the pads. So we decided to go ahead and use a bit of time and a spare can of black caliper paint to go ahead and coat them. Now we didn't want to spray the areas where the brake pads contact, and we were trying to come up with an idea on how to cover those. Well, we realized the box the rotors come in, well, they actually have a visible depression where the rotor sat in the box, and it serves as a wonderful template. Just cut that area out and it covers the surface of the rotor perfectly. A bit of masking tape seals the deal. And that inside piece that you just cut out, well, that actually covers the inner hat, which is where the parking brake shoes sit. So once again, it's a perfect fit. All right, there we go. There, just like that. Now, any paint you get on the rotor surface can be easily wiped off with brake cleaner. In the end, our half-price rotors looked pretty good, and we only spent about $7 on that can of paint to do all 4. As we start to tear down the rear brakes, it's important to note that the service manual references some models of this year F250 have their brakes integral to the hub, requiring hub removal. However, on this SRW or single rear wheel version, our rotor is simple to remove. Since we're replacing the caliper, rotors, and pads, we can simply remove the caliper bracket with the 18mm bolts in the back. After removing the flexible line banjo bolt, we'll simply remove the caliper anchor and the whole assembly will come off in one piece. Let's try our small hammer. Next, we can remove the rotor, which may need some persuasion with your favorite hammer. And maybe even your favorite bigger hammer. And sometimes your favorite biggest hammer. As we remove this one, just watch how much rust piles up on the floor. Each hit made us more happy we were replacing everything. And just keep hammering. Eventually it'll come off. Sometimes you just need a bigger hammer. All right, so we got our rotor off, as you can see, so we're gonna roll that off to the side here. And as we took it off, you can see a lot of this fine red rust dust came out. Kind of one of the reasons we're doing this and why there's a lot of rust just from sitting, and why it's good to pull some of this stuff apart. So the other thing you look at is just look at all the other crusty rust that came off from the rotor there, which is one reason we're painting our other ones, to try to fend that off a little bit. And if we really wanted to protect it, we'd get some coated rotors, which we probably should have done, but didn't. So what you're gonna wanna do when you get out, all that done, is inspect your parking brake mechanism, your emergency brake. Make sure the shoes aren't worn, make sure that everything isn't too crusty and rusty, that the springs aren't broken. So you can just kind of peek around in there. And I'm looking on ours, I'm gonna give it a thumbs up. We're looking pretty good. So we're gonna go ahead and do that, clean this up. At the same time, we're gonna look at our dust shield here. I'm happy, this is solid, this is in good shape. I was really worried that this thing would be completely deteriorated and gone. We'll clean up our caliper bracket. Now's a good time to mask this off. You don't wanna, get paint on your shoes or anything like that. But if it's a good time, anything that you missed when you were coating your frame, now's not a bad time to go ahead and do the mechanisms here before you start putting new parts on. Clean your end piece up here. So we'll come through and do that. But yeah, look at that, lots of rust. Once we've cleaned and prepped everything, we can go ahead and install our new DIY coated rotor. These rear caliper bracket bolts torque to 128 pound-feet, but you'll want to check your service manual, as this can vary based on the trim, axle, and spec of your specific truck, even if it's the same year. We sped everything else up here because, well, quite frankly, it's just installing disc brakes, and since everything was new, it all went together smoothly. When it came to the caliper bolting to the anchor, the slider bolts on this F250 SRW were 27 pound-feet. But some of the heavy-duty trucks spec for 41 foot-pounds. Again, it depends on your model, trim, and brake setup, so it's best to validate in the service manual for your vehicle. And of course, we did use fresh copper gaskets on our banjo bolt for the fluid line, and we didn't over-tighten it. In the end, we knew we had a refreshed rear brake system here, but honestly, the visuals of the before and after are pretty great to look at. And sure, the refreshed rears did look great, but it was the fronts that were really nasty looking. This will be an even bigger transformation. I mean, wait till you see the shape the pads are in. Look at that. Jeez. The caliper anchor bolts were also tough to get off. In the end, we used a 1/2-inch ratchet with a, well, somewhat large amount of leverage from a piece of square tubing. At least they came off easy after that, and this piece can go in the core return pile. The fun didn't end there, though. Now, I've definitely had my fair share of rotors that were rusted to the hub face and took some hammering or heat to help them off. But these front rotors, well, they take the top spot. Even with PB Blaster soaking, the BFH didn't even budge them. Now, I didn't have my torch set up at this time, so I decided to try something else, the air hammer, which after I did this, I bought new hammer dies because, well, the best I had at the time was a groove chisel bit. Well, it took hammering all around the face and the sides, and that finally helped free it. A few more swift hits and it popped loose.
Oh yeah! I know I can use this. See, that's all you needed was one of these. Oh Lord! Oh my gosh! Oh boy! Oh boy!
I gotta say, I'm certainly glad we're replacing these rotors. And well, hammering on one with a 10-pound short-handled sledge, that's a pretty decent arm workout. After fighting with the rotor, I was happy to see the hub bearing cleaned up well and was in good shape. I mean, this truck only has 80,000 miles on it after all. A bit of rust encapsulator helped to preserve the dust shield, and some anti-seize on the face of the hub will help the new rotor come off later. Finally, we were putting new parts on, but sadly we didn't get too far this day. I mean, sure, the rotor went on easy. And the new caliper anchor bolts went in with no problem. This one was torqued to 166 pound-feet, but remember to check your service manual for your specs. The big issue though? Well, the rotor and pad kit I had the wrong pads in it. Look at this crap. It was so obvious. That is no way the right one. So we sent them back and we were able to install the hardware that came with the calipers. And a few days later, we got replacements, and once again, they were wrong. We're back here on our F250. We received our new brake pads from Amazon. So we are all set to go ahead and get our pads installed here. As you remember, we had the wrong ones that were shipped in our kit. Well, I knew something was wrong once again when this was in the hardware kit. The box looked like this and was ripped up, and the pads themselves were dusty and cut open. So I knew I was in for it. I mean, just look at this box. Now granted, this was all just before COVID-19 got big in the States. So we switched parts vendors for the third try, and in the meantime, put the caliper on with no pads, and at least we were able to go ahead and install the new flexible line. When we finally got the new pads, we installed them on a live stream. All right, everyone. Hopefully our audio is working and hopefully we're actually live. What we're doing today, we're going to go ahead and work on putting brake pads on this side of our F250. The holdup was I received the wrong brake pads twice now for this truck. So finally got the new ones about a week and a half ago, and they've been sitting in the box waiting to get done. Fortunately, before a lot of this coronavirus stuff really took hold. So got the right parts. Pretty confident because I looked and they look pretty much the same. Part number matches up. So I think we're in good shape this time. Fortunately, Rock Auto rocks, and they sent us the right parts the first time. Now, if you have a keen eye here, you might see that I forgot to install something. So these pin bolts right here, these are 42 foot-pounds, which is actually quite a bit, but this is a heavy-duty truck. In a lot of passenger cars, this is usually more around the 25 range to 30 range, which is why you want to check your service manual. There we go, torque to spec. Hey everyone, just going live again from my phone really quick. So I was picking up some parts, put everything away from the stream that we just did, and I realized that I forgot these little springs. So we're going to pop them in really quick. There we go. So we got those in, and then we can just slide our caliper back on. This is really awkward. There we go. You catch the drift. I'll go ahead and finish up the other one when I got two hands. Of course, we still had those crusty old brake hard lines to deal with. You know, as I started pulling the 1/4-inch line that runs to the back wheels and basically having it disintegrate into pieces, I knew we pretty much had to replace every single hard line on this truck. And doing that also meant revisiting something from our earlier work and adding more things to our to-do list. So we're pressing ahead on replacing our brake lines, and we'll show you we've done some really good progress in terms of getting the new hard lines bent and installed across our rear axle to our rear brakes. So we're focusing right now on the 1/4-inch line that runs from our rear center brake hose to the front of our truck to the ABS module, to the ABS pump. So a couple things. First of all, the axle itself uses a 3/16 brake line, so that's important to know. And it is a 1/4-inch brake line, at least on this truck, from the center hose to the front to that ABS pump. Now, that single brake line piece, here it is. Four pieces is what came out. I don't even know. This went up to the front. This back piece snapped off. This center piece that went between that and the other first piece I showed you also snapped, so we actually had two breaks within that line. And then in the back of the line and the front of the line, there were two repairs. This particular repair was here. This one was up front, also had a coil in it, and then it went down into the ABS pump. This is why life is going to be difficult. So I'll show you with the other camera there, so hopefully we'll have some different views as we go through here, but essentially our fuel tank sits pretty close to the frame. There's only about an inch in some areas between the tank and the top piece of the frame rail. Obviously inside this C-channel there's more room. Well, you have your fuel send and return line, you have your vent line that goes to your charcoal canister, and then you have your brake line in there as well. Well, the brake line is all the way at the bottom of that mess, plus you have the electrical harness that runs there too. What we're facing is the challenge that actually pulling out the brake line was quite difficult, and probably one of the reasons that the weak spots broke as I was pulling it out is that there's just literally no room for the bends. The bends in that line, it's very difficult to pull this out from the frame with the fuel tank in place. So the thought of trying to get this back in without mangling it and actually mimicking the factory bends, or heaven forbid I buy a factory line and try to put it in, I really just don't see how I'm going to be able to fit that in here with this tank in place. So that brings us to the next fun and a good example of why projects like this often spiral out of control. Because here's the thing, dropping the tank is probably not going to be super trivial here. All right, there's a fair amount of rust that you've seen on this truck. Well, I'll tell you something else that's rusty. The bolts that hold the skid plate, the fuel tank skid, and the fuel tank straps all look pretty bad. Extra work, extra time. There's the obviousness of I'm probably going to have to get tank straps and I'm probably going to have to replace some bolts here is kind of what I'm facing. So that's just the nature of it. But what we're going to do, you know, we can look at it one of two ways, right? We could just go ahead and try to hand form a brake line, jam it through here, get it to the other side, attach it up, and just zip tie it in and be done with it. And we'd roll it on down the road. But wherever possible, I really prefer to try to do things to match how the factory did it. So if I'm going to put a new brake line in here, I want to use the factory attachment points. I don't want that line to be rubbing against stuff. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and do it properly. We're going to drop the tank, incur the wrath of the straps, and probably replace them, and just roll our eyes and say, hey, we're going to dive in pain in the ass mode and go ahead and do this. Now, hey, I look at it this way. This is something that we're doing so that we can have a nice shop truck around here, something that's reliable, that we can trust, and that can haul some stuff for us and do a good job at it. I'm going to take the extra time and do this right. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to drop this tank. As we wrap up today, we'll leave you with a few shots of the lines that were pulled off this truck. And on our next video, we're going to show you what we did to replace them, a mix of hand-formed and aftermarket lines. And also, we're going to show you the details of what it took to remove and reinstall the gas tank. Now we'll be back with more in part 3, so definitely subscribe and stay tuned here on Vortex Garage.